Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to continue looking at factoring. Today we're going to tackle a concept called factor by grouping, and it's going to utilize those skills we learned in the last video, which involved the GCF. So, factor by grouping, we're going to use this when we have polynomials with 4 or more terms. So what that means is we're going to put terms are put into groups and then factored using, sorry you can't see that, factored using GCFs. Alright, so you can see I gave you kind of the math description of it. Alright, you see this example right here. It's a little bit complicated, but let's go ahead and jump into an example and you will see what I mean. So, when we factor by grouping, what we want to do is we want to make sure it's in standard form first. So I don't want anything jumping the line. So you'll see in this first example, this first term has 2 variables, the next term has 1, the next term has 1, and then I have my constant term. That's okay. So when I factor by grouping, I'm going to break the first 2 terms into a group. And I'm going to ask myself, what is the greatest common factor between 4QR and 8R? Well, the greatest common factor is 4R. What's left over? Q plus 2. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to group my second 2 terms. And I'm going to ask myself, what is the greatest common factor of 3Q and 6? Well, the greatest common factor there is positive 3. What's left over? Q plus 2. Well, hang on. If you'll notice, both of these terms now share a q plus 2 in common. So I can factor out the q plus 2, and what am I left with? 4r plus 3. So there we factored that polynomial with 4 terms. We factored that correctly. Now this is going to be a very important skill that we are going to use over the next couple videos. Alright, we're just grouping together the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms, factoring out their GCF, and then making sure that this part right here is the same, and then we can factor that out again. Alright, so let's look at number 2. Is it in standard form? Yes, looks good to go. So let's group the first 2 terms together. 3NP and 15P. What goes into both of those? 3P. What's left over? N plus 5. So let's look at our second group now. Negative 4n minus 20. The GCF, notice how the leading term is negative. So I need to take out that negative. And what's the greatest common factor between negative 4n and negative 20? That'd be negative 4. What's left over? N plus 5. Remember, just like we talked about in the previous video, you can check your work at this step. Distribute back in and make sure you end up with what you started with. Now, notice we are good to go because these 2 parts, those 2 factors are the same. So I can factor out n plus 5 and I'm left with 3p minus 4. And then I can double check my work here as well. Double distribute n plus 5 times 3p minus 4 and make sure you end up with what you started with. Okay? Let's go on to number 3. Is this in descending order? Well, 3, not quite. If you'll notice, 42 is trying to jump ahead of negative 7k. So I need to flip-flop these. Before I start factor by grouping, I need to flip-flop 42 and negative 7k. And then, let's group them together. Let's group our first 2 terms, and let's group our last 2 terms. So, in the first 2 terms, 2mk and negative 12m, what goes into both of those? 2m, and I'm left with k minus 6. Now, my second group, I look for the GCF between negative 7k and 42. Well, my GCF there is negative 7, and I'm left with k minus 6. At this point, do your quick mental check, double or distribute that back in. Make sure you end up with what you started with. If you're good to go, then you did that step correctly. Now we can notice that they each share a k minus 6. So let's factor out k minus 6. What am I left with? 2m minus 7. And I factored that correctly. Now, some of you may be wondering, what if I have 2m minus 7 first? What if I have 2m minus 7 times k minus 6? Is that all right? That is 100% correct. All right, multiplication doesn't matter which way you multiply it. Both of those answers would be good to go. All right, now let's finish it out with number 4. Check to see if it's in standard form. I got 3p minus 2p squared minus 18p plus 27. Well, if you'll notice, 3p is trying to jump ahead of negative 2p squared. So I need to rearrange this and put it in descending order. Now, some of you may notice that I have like terms here. I have 3p minus 18p. And so by instinct, I'm going to want to combine those. But I want you to hold off. I want you to fight that instinct. And I want you to just leave it as is. Because this skill right here, a problem that looks like number 4, is going to come up a lot in the future. So I want you to leave it as it is right now. Notice you have 4 terms. I want you to group together and then factor by grouping. So I've got negative 2p squared plus 3p. Well, I want to factor out the GCF right there, which is going to be negative p. And I'm left with 2p minus 3. And then negative 18p plus 27, I want to factor out negative 9. And I'm left with 2p minus 3. So if you'll notice, they each share a 2p minus 3 in common. So I'm going to factor that out. And I'm left with negative p minus 9. Now, I'm going to take it a step further now. So this is kind of our challenge problem for the notes. 2p minus 3, that's okay. But if I look right here at negative p minus 9, that first term in there is negative. So I need to factor out that negative 1, and that's going to leave me with p plus 9. And then I have 2p minus 3 just coming along for the ride. All right? So I could have tackled that problem several ways. Let's do this problem a different way. From here, I could have factored out the negative 1. Because you see that leading term is negative. So I could factor out the negative 1. And then I'm left with 2p squared minus 3p plus 18p minus 27. And then I could factor by grouping like we have been. So the negative 1 still chilling on the outside. If I look at my first group, I factor out a p, and I'm left with 2p minus 3. From the second group, I factor out a 9, and I'm left with 2p minus 3. They share a 2p minus 3 in common. So I've got this negative 1, which comes down on the outside. I've got the 2p minus 3, and I've got p plus 9. So if you'll notice, what I circled in red and what we boxed in black, those are the same exact answers, but just 2 different ways to solve that problem, both utilizing factoring by grouping. All right, so these are the skills that we will practice. This, along with practicing that greatest common factor, these are the skills that we'll practice the next time I see you. Once again, since we're not talking about solving yet, let's skip these 2 questions. And then on the you try nows, focus on questions 1 and 2. Go ahead and skip 3 and 4. If you want to practice factoring by grouping, you can do that on 3 and 4, but you do not need to solve those questions. All right, so just focus on 1 and 2 for the next time I see you. As always, be safe and be good. Do some good, and I will see you when I see you.